No exaggeration and no blanket assumptions. It's worth looking at what the numbers actually show. Beyond the palm-lined streets and colorful coastal neighborhoods, certain Florida housing markets are experiencing meaningful price corrections in 2026, while others are simply cooling after years of rapid appreciation. Those are two very different situations, and understanding that distinction is critical whether you're planning to buy or preparing to sell. When you look at the state as a whole, the market tells a far more balanced story than many headlines suggest. Florida's median closed home price in early 2026 sits at roughly $394,000 to $396,000, representing only a modest year-over-year decline of around 1% to 1.3%. At the same time, housing inventory has continued to rise, approaching 7.5 months of supply, while the typical home now spends approximately 69 to 84 days on the market before finding a buyer. In this countdown, we're ranking 10 Florida cities using verified 2026 figures for sale prices, inventory levels, and average days on the market, not speculation or sensational predictions. And as you'll soon discover, a few of the cities often labeled as crashing are, in reality, maintaining their home values far better than many people expect. Number 1. Ocala, Florida. Ocala is the smallest housing market on this list, but it's also one of the few where the slowdown reflects a genuine price correction rather than just shifting sentiment. According to Redfin's February 2026 data, the median home sold for $275,000, marking a 5.2% decline compared with the same time last year. Homes are also taking longer to sell, remaining on the market for an average of 96 days, up from 88 days a year earlier. The reasons behind that decline are fairly clear. A wave of new residential construction expanded inventory much faster than local incomes could keep up. Ocala's economy is heavily supported by manufacturing, agriculture, and warehousing, and wage growth in those industries simply hasn't matched the rapid rise in home prices seen during the housing boom. Now here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Although prices have fallen by about 5%, the data doesn't point to residents abandoning the area. Instead, most buyers are still looking for homes within the Ocala metro itself, rather than leaving for other regions. That suggests this is a market adjusting to excess supply, not one experiencing a widespread population flight. Redfin's migration data reinforces that conclusion. In recent months, the majority of Ocala home shoppers were searching for another property within the same metropolitan area. At the same time, the city continued attracting a steady stream of buyers from places like Miami, Orlando, and even other states. The inflow isn't overwhelming, but it has remained consistent. When you combine falling prices with continued buyer interest from both local residents and newcomers, the picture looks much more like a healthy market correction than a community people are rushing to leave. There's another clue supporting that idea as well. Ocala's median price per square foot has remained almost unchanged, slipping by less than 1% over the past year. That suggests the weakness is concentrated mainly in certain categories, particularly larger or newer homes, rather than affecting the entire housing market equally. Number 2. St. Petersburg, Florida. St. Petersburg is often portrayed as one of Florida's biggest real estate trouble spots, but the latest market data paints a very different picture. Rather than showing signs of a major collapse, the numbers indicate a market that is gradually returning to a healthier balance. According to House Canary's regional analysis, the broader Tampa-St. Petersburg-Clearwater metro recorded a 2.5% year-over-year increase in home prices during early 2026, making it one of the stronger performing major metropolitan areas in the state. Looking specifically at St. Petersburg, some recent market reports show median sale prices climbing by double digits compared with a year earlier. At the same time, homes are spending longer on the market, and inventory has continued to expand. Those trends might sound contradictory at first, but together they actually describe a market that is cooling from an exceptionally hot period rather than slipping into serious trouble. Here's the important distinction. Rising inventory and slower sales don't automatically signal a housing crash. When prices continue moving higher while buyers gain more choices, it's usually evidence that an overheated market is returning to normal conditions after years of extremely limited supply. That's exactly what's happening in St. Petersburg. The city isn't experiencing a sharp downturn. It has simply moved beyond the frantic pace that defined the pandemic housing boom. Sellers can no longer expect homes to disappear almost instantly, and buyers have more opportunities to compare properties before making an offer. For home buyers, the biggest change isn't dramatic price reductions. Instead, it's greater negotiating power and a much wider selection of available homes. Industry analysts covering the Tampa Bay region expect this trend toward a more balanced market to continue throughout 2026, with inventory gradually improving while home prices post modest, sustainable gains instead of reversing into a steep decline. Number 3. Lakeland, Florida. Not long ago, Lakeland was frequently identified as one of Florida's housing markets most likely to experience a sharp downturn. But the 2026 data tells a much more measured story. The median sale price sits at roughly $315,000, while median listing prices have actually increased by more than 10% compared with a year ago. At the same time, active inventory has grown by approximately 19%, according to local housing market reports. That combination is important. More homes are becoming available, yet sellers are still asking higher prices. Instead of signaling widespread panic or distressed selling, those numbers point to a market that is gradually finding balance after years of extremely limited inventory. Homes are also continuing to sell in less than 2 months on average, showing that demand remains healthy despite the growing selection of available properties. Here's the key takeaway. An increase in listings is often interpreted as a warning sign, but context matters. When inventory rises while prices continue moving upward, it usually reflects a market easing back toward normal conditions rather than one falling apart. Buyers finally have more options, yet sellers are still maintaining pricing power. That trend becomes even clearer when looking specifically at single-family homes. Median listing prices have climbed from roughly $340,000 to $360,000 over the past year. Even with additional inventory entering the market, the supply of available homes remains relatively limited compared with buyer demand. As a result, local housing analysts continue to describe Lakeland as a market where sellers hold a strong negotiating position, not one where they're being forced into aggressive price cuts. Lakeland's local economy also helps explain why demand has remained resilient. Its strategic location between Tampa and Orlando has made the city a major hub for logistics, distribution, and warehousing. That employment base continues attracting buyers, including many commuters who work in either metropolitan area, providing steady housing demand even as new construction expands inventory. It's worth pausing here for a moment because a clear pattern is beginning to emerge. Halfway through this countdown, several cities that are frequently labeled as crash markets are actually posting stable or even increasing home prices. That isn't the result of carefully selecting favorable examples. It's a reflection of what the 2026 data across much of Florida actually shows. The markets experiencing meaningful corrections are concentrated in a relatively small number of locations rather than spread evenly across the state. That nuance is often missing from dramatic countdown videos, where highlighting the most alarming narrative tends to generate far more attention than presenting the full picture. Number 4. Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville has unquestionably seen inventory increase, and its economy, heavily tied to shipping, logistics, and transportation, has faced some real headwinds. Even so, the housing data doesn't support the dramatic downturn that many earlier forecasts anticipated. According to Redfin's May 2026 figures, the city's median sale price sits at approximately $350,000, representing a 0.9% increase from the previous year. Homes are also selling in about 60 days on average, almost identical to the pace recorded a year earlier. Some housing forecasts do suggest Jacksonville could experience a modest cooling period before the market stabilizes. But there's an important difference between expecting a slight slowdown and predicting a deeply overvalued market headed for a major collapse. Those are two very different scenarios. Another interesting detail comes from the city's price per square foot data. While the overall median sale price has remained relatively flat, the median price per square foot has climbed by nearly 3% year over year. That points to a shift in buyer preferences rather than weakening demand. Smaller, more affordable homes continue attracting solid interest, while buyers have become more selective when it comes to larger and more expensive properties. Here's the key insight. Jacksonville's relative affordability may be one of its greatest strengths. With median home prices still roughly 22% below the national median, the market has been better positioned to absorb higher mortgage rates than many of Florida's more expensive cities. Lower-priced markets often retain buyers longer because monthly payments remain within reach for a larger share of households. Sales activity also remains surprisingly healthy. In a recent month alone, more than 3,500 homes changed hands across the Jacksonville area, demonstrating that buyers are still actively participating in the market. Multiple offer situations continue to occur often enough that Redfin still describes Jacksonville as a somewhat competitive housing market rather than one that has stalled. Taken together, these indicators don't describe a major port city entering a prolonged housing correction. Instead, they suggest a market that has slowed to a more sustainable pace while continuing to benefit from steady demand and comparatively affordable home prices. Number 5. Port St. Lucie, Florida. Port St. Lucie has frequently appeared on lists of Florida's most overvalued housing markets, and there are legitimate reasons for that concern. Affordability remains a significant challenge, with median household income falling short of what many buyers would need to comfortably purchase a typical mid-priced home at today's mortgage rates. Florida Atlantic University's Affordability Index has consistently ranked Port St. Lucie among the state's most stretched markets when comparing local incomes with home values. Even so, affordability pressure doesn't automatically translate into falling home prices. According to House Canary's regional data, home prices in Port St. Lucie have remained largely stable through early 2026, posting a modest 0.9% year-over-year increase. Rather than showing strong appreciation or a steep decline, the market has settled into a period of relative stability alongside several other Florida metropolitan areas. That's an important distinction. The current data points to a market that has paused after a rapid run-up in prices, not one that has entered a dramatic downturn. Here's the key point. Being labeled overvalued is a warning about future risk if wages fail to catch up with housing costs. It does not mean prices are destined to collapse immediately. So far, the actual sales data from 2026 hasn't shown evidence of the sharp correction many people expected. There's another factor worth considering as well. Redfin's income analysis indicates that median household income in Port St. Lucie is actually above the national median, even though it hasn't risen quickly enough to match the extraordinary jump in home prices during the 2021 and 2022 housing boom. That's very different from a market where demand has completely disappeared or buyers have walked away altogether. The entry-level segment also remains relatively competitive. Starter homes, typically priced around $290,000, are broadly comparable to starter home prices seen across the country. That suggests first-time buyers haven't been pushed entirely out of the market, despite the affordability challenges facing many households. Taken together, the evidence suggests Port St. Lucie is navigating a period of strained affordability rather than experiencing the kind of widespread housing collapse often portrayed in dramatic market forecasts. Number 6. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Fort Lauderdale presents one of the more interesting housing stories in Florida because the market has undeniably slowed, yet the dramatic price collapse many people predicted still hasn't happened. During the remote work boom, it was one of the state's hottest coastal markets, with homes selling quickly and buyers competing aggressively. In 2026, however, the landscape has changed. By most standard measurements, Fort Lauderdale has shifted into buyer's market territory. Data from Redfin and other market analysts shows median sale prices generally ranging between $580,000 and $600,000. Despite the slower market, prices remain largely unchanged from a year ago, with some reports showing slight annual gains rather than losses. What has changed significantly is the pace of the market. Homes are now spending an average of 105 days on the market, and available inventory has grown to roughly 7 to 8 months of supply. Those figures clearly indicate that buyers have considerably more choices and far less pressure to make immediate decisions. Here's the important distinction. Many market commentaries assume that rising inventory and longer selling times automatically lead to falling home prices. Fort Lauderdale demonstrates that this isn't always the case. While sellers no longer hold the same advantage they enjoyed a few years ago, prices have remained relatively stable, even as the market has become much less competitive. Instead of values dropping sharply, the biggest shift has been in negotiating power. Buyers now have more time to compare properties, negotiate better terms, and avoid the bidding wars that once defined this market. The city's diverse housing stock also helps explain why pricing can appear inconsistent. Condominiums, which represent a substantial portion of Fort Lauderdale's inventory, are selling for an average of around $428,000. Single-family homes, meanwhile, typically fall somewhere between $580,000 and $700,000, depending on the data source and reporting period. That wide spread illustrates how a single median price can oversimplify what's actually happening across different segments of the market. Another notable point is that overall sales activity has remained fairly consistent compared with last year. Buyers haven't disappeared. They're simply operating under very different conditions. The real story in Fort Lauderdale isn't collapsing demand or plunging home values. It's a market where the pace has slowed, inventory has expanded, and negotiating power has gradually shifted away from sellers and toward buyers. Number 7. Tampa, Florida. Tampa is a perfect example of how housing statistics can tell very different stories depending on which dataset you're looking at. If you focus only on the city itself, the market appears to be cooling. Recent figures show a median sale price of about $443,000, down roughly 1.4% from a year ago, while the average time to sell a home has increased from 36 days to 41 days. However, the picture changes once you look beyond the city limits. Across the larger Tampa St. Petersburg Clearwater metropolitan area, home prices have actually increased by approximately 2.5% year over year during the same period. Here's the important takeaway. Neither of these figures is incorrect. They're both based on legitimate data. The difference is simply the area being measured. Tampa proper has experienced a modest slowdown, while many surrounding communities have continued to perform well enough to lift the overall metro average. That's the kind of local variation that often disappears when a single headline statistic is used to support a dramatic housing crash narrative. There are certainly real challenges affecting buyers in Tampa. Property taxes have increased, insurance premiums remain elevated, and the overall cost of homeownership has become more expensive. Those pressures are influencing buyer behavior and slowing the pace of the market. But that's very different from the type of widespread panic selling that would produce steep double-digit price declines. Instead, the market is adjusting gradually, with homes taking a little longer to sell and buyers gaining more negotiating leverage while prices remain relatively stable. Viewed in the broader context, the Tampa Metro's 2.5% annual price growth actually outperforms Florida's statewide median. That creates an interesting contradiction for anyone arguing that Tampa represents the center of a statewide housing collapse. The data simply supports a more nuanced conclusion. The market is cooling, but it is not unraveling. Number 8. Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota Northport is one of the few markets in Florida where the slowdown is clearly visible in the data, placing it alongside areas such as Cape Coral as one of the state's more noticeable corrections. Multiple housing reports from 2026 identify portions of Florida's Gulf Coast as experiencing the deepest price adjustments, with Sarasota's luxury waterfront market leading much of that decline. The reason is fairly straightforward. During the 2021 and 2022 housing boom, affluent retirees and out-of-state buyers drove extraordinary demand for high-end coastal properties. Since then, that buyer pool has become smaller as higher mortgage rates and increased stock market volatility have made luxury purchases less attractive. Even so, the broader market tells a more balanced story. Local housing reports continue to show healthy demand for reasonably priced single-family homes. Buyers have become more selective, sellers are adjusting their expectations, and inventory has returned to levels that are much closer to historical norms after the exceptionally tight conditions seen during the pandemic. At the same time, homes are spending longer on the market before selling, giving buyers more time and more choices than they had just a few years ago. Much of the alarming coverage surrounding Sarasota comes from individual luxury properties that have undergone substantial price reductions since their ambitious 2022 asking prices. Those homes certainly attract attention, but they represent a very specific segment of the market. They shouldn't be viewed as an accurate reflection of what the average Sarasota homebuyer is experiencing today. Here's the important distinction. A market undergoing a correction is not necessarily a market in collapse. Sarasota's luxury coastal sector is working through a genuine, multi-year adjustment as demand from wealthy out-of-state buyers moderates. Meanwhile, prices and sales activity for typical single-family homes have remained considerably more stable than many dramatic headlines imply. The behavior of builders provides another useful clue. In nearby Lakewood Ranch, developers have generally relied on incentives, such as assistance with closing costs and other buyer concessions, to encourage sales rather than making aggressive price reductions. That approach suggests they're adapting to a slower market, not desperately trying to clear excess inventory. Construction timelines also support that conclusion. New homes in the area are still being built on schedules of roughly 9 to 12 months, which isn't the pattern you'd expect if builders were facing widespread panic or an urgent need to liquidate unsold homes. Number 9. Fort Myers, Florida. Fort Myers, together with neighboring Cape Coral, is one of the few Florida markets where the current housing correction is both significant and clearly supported by the data. Regional forecasts throughout 2026 consistently identify this Gulf Coast metro as one of the state's weakest performers, and the reasons behind that slowdown are well understood. To understand today's market, it's important to remember what happened during the boom. Between 2022 and 2024, home values in Fort Myers surged by more than 65%, making it one of the fastest appreciating housing markets in Florida. When prices rise that quickly, a stronger correction later on is often a natural consequence once demand begins to normalize. Several factors have combined to increase downward pressure. Rental demand has cooled as tourism growth has slowed, and many investors who purchase short-term rental properties near the market peak are now among the most motivated sellers. With rental income no longer producing the returns they originally expected, many have become willing to accept larger discounts in order to exit those investments. The market is also still dealing with the long-term effects of Hurricane Ian. Properties that required repairs have gradually returned to the market over the past several years, increasing available inventory. At the same time, homeowners continue facing some of the highest insurance premiums in Florida, while a wave of post-storm construction expanded housing supply faster than buyer demand recovered. Here's the key distinction. Fort Myers is one of the rare cities on this list where the combination of rapid construction, elevated insurance costs, and softening demand genuinely aligns with the housing data. The correction here is real rather than exaggerated. Even so, most forecasts do not point to an endless downward spiral. Instead, many analysts expect the market to gradually stabilize by 2027, which is a very different outlook from the idea of an uncontrolled housing collapse with no clear bottom. For buyers who are comfortable taking on today's insurance costs, the current environment offers opportunities that haven't existed for years. Builders are competing aggressively by offering incentives, and resale homeowners are becoming much more willing to negotiate instead of insisting on the premium prices that were common during the 2022 housing frenzy. Fort Myers does face a legitimate long-term challenge. Its economy depends heavily on tourism and construction, with fewer diversified industries to cushion the impact when those sectors slow. That structural weakness deserves attention. But recognizing those economic risks is very different from claiming the housing market is in an unrestricted freefall. The evidence points to a meaningful correction, one that appears to be working through the excesses of the previous boom, rather than spiraling without an end in sight. Number 10. Cape Coral, Florida. Cape Coral stands out as the market with the clearest and most consistently documented housing correction in Florida. Among all the cities on this list, it's the one where virtually every major data source points to the same conclusion and even reaches a similar estimate of the decline. According to Adams' first quarter 2026 data, Cape Coral recorded the steepest home price drop of any major U.S. housing market in its analysis, while broader market estimates place the annual decline at approximately 9% to 10%. The reasons behind that correction are neither sudden nor mysterious. Following the pandemic housing boom, an aggressive wave of new construction flooded the market, causing active listings to more than double within just a few years. At the same time, repeated hurricane exposure pushed homeowners' insurance premiums dramatically higher, with many annual policies climbing into the five-figure range. Adding even more pressure, many out-of-state investors who purchased properties expecting continued appreciation have begun selling as price growth slowed and investment returns became less attractive. Here's the most important point in this entire countdown. Even in Cape Coral, the weakest performing market on this list, the data does not point to a complete market breakdown. In fact, transaction volume has started increasing as lower prices attract buyers who were previously priced out of the market. More inventory, greater negotiating flexibility, and improved affordability are encouraging demand rather than driving buyers away entirely. Builders have responded by offering substantial incentives, including meaningful price reductions and assistance with closing costs, as they compete against a growing number of resale listings. That's certainly difficult for homeowners who purchased near the market peak in 2022, but it's also a normal part of how housing markets eventually stabilize. Sellers adjust their expectations, buyers return, and prices gradually find a sustainable level instead of continuing to fall indefinitely. Even within Cape Coral itself, the correction hasn't affected every property equally. Waterfront homes with direct Gulf access have generally performed better than the broader market, continuing to command premium prices despite the wider slowdown. That serves as another reminder that housing markets rarely move in perfect unison. Different neighborhoods and property types can experience very different trends at the same time. So what does Florida's housing market actually look like in 2026? The evidence suggests that Cape Coral and Fort Myers are undergoing the state's most significant and well-documented corrections, driven largely by excess construction, elevated insurance costs, and changing investor demand. Sarasota Northport has also experienced a meaningful slowdown, while Ocala has recorded a smaller but legitimate decline. In many ways, the increase in statewide inventory may actually be a healthy development. After years of severe housing shortages during the early 2020s, buyers finally have more options, and the market is moving closer to a more balanced relationship between supply and demand. That's not necessarily evidence that Florida's housing market is unraveling. It may simply reflect a return to more typical conditions. If you're considering buying, selling, or waiting this year, remember that location matters far more than statewide averages. The specific city is often more important than the statewide trend, and the individual neighborhood can matter even more than the city itself.